works. Cool. With that said, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open today's debate. Hear, hear.
Sorry, just dropped water all over my notes. Okay, no. Make black. POIs. I provide my POIs audibly, please, because I am incapable of reading and debating at the same time. So if they're in the chat, I will not see them. With that, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech today. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why this is fundamentally justified. Then I'm going to tell you why this is not likely to be misused by these companies. And then thirdly, I'm going to tell you why it's the duties of these companies to protect the most vulnerable workers in their supply chain. Firstly, a bit of a model here. We want a clean debate. What does this look like? 3 things. Firstly, I don't think this debate is about extreme weaponization of these companies. I don't think anybody's going to go full Oppenheimer and get an atomic bomb. I don't think people are going to develop like crazy nuclear systems. And I don't think these companies are suddenly going to act like sovereign nations and declare war on people. This is not what we're debating. We're debating their ability to militarize. What does militarization look like? Secondly, I think this looks like investing in significant security systems, soldier-like combatants who can respond to threats with arms and who have the right to do this. We think, firstly, this, they're not going to do this unprovoked. They have no interest in just like stoking local conflicts. Note that no company ever would be like, you know what's a really good idea if I piss off a bunch of people in Ethiopia. The value proposition there is stupid. B, we think they're only going to do this if they're attacked in the first place, if there's a significant threat to their companies. I think thirdly, people will know that these combatants are there, these soldiers are there, the host countries and the home countries will know that this exists, etc. It's kind of like when you do FDI in a country, you're like, we're bringing in these people, we're bringing in these soldiers. Now, moving on to my first argument, why is this justified? I think I want to, the framing is very important here. Note that we think this is most likely to be used in companies like shipping companies, resource extraction companies, etc. I want to make it very, very clear that these are crucial services to the whole economy. Sure, you might be like, oh, what does it matter if I get my Amazon package tomorrow? But the global shipping economy is so much bigger than that. These are the people who send you your medication that ensure that you can live another day. These are the people who send grain from Ukraine to avoid a famine in West Africa. This is incredibly important. The second piece of framing I want to bring here is that we're living in a world, and I'm sure you all know this, of increased insecurity. There are more wars happening that are threatening the global supply chains, etc. This is why this is necessary. Now, with that, 3 points under this. Firstly, I want to make it very clear that because there are these threats to the global supply chains, making sure that global supply chains are secure is what enables multinational trade in the first place. All companies rely on multinational trade. You might not know this, but even like the salmon fished in Norway doesn't just go, and if I buy it in the supermarket in Denmark, it doesn't just go from Norway to Denmark. It goes from Norway to Thailand where it's packed and then back to Denmark. That takes like 5 different ships, but all of that is so I can get my omega-3s in. All goods are transported and all goods rely on this fundamental network. B, literally no one can function without global trade. Like even your tiny local business shop around the corner in whatever country you are in right now relies on at least like 10 imported products from all over the world. These supply chains need to be ironclad and they need to be secure for your everyday life to secure. These are the differences of whether or not you can like eat what you want to eat, whether or not people in West Africa are starving, whether or not you can wash your hair with your preferred shampoo, small and big things. This is the case for all countries, even like North Korea. Secondly, this is also massively important to the world economy, not just to the everyday goods. I want to make sure that value chains are the very center of economies. No matter what company you have invested in, their stocks and their prices, etc., rely on these value chains. Imagine what's going to happen to like Amazon or Apple stocks if there's a significant threat to value chains. They're going to tank, and this is not only going to have like this is not only going to be a problem for like big investment bankers. It's going to be a problem for all of our pension funds, etc., because all of us rely on this financialized economy. So when there is crisis, this crisis is going to hit all of us, and it's going to be an economic threat that we have never seen anywhere. This is going to be incredibly harmful. Thirdly, I would like to say that this is the best option because the only other alternative that exists on opposition is that sovereign countries step in once there's a threat. The alternative is like your host country or that you're in or the home country steps in. Firstly, this is bad because that's a tax burden on individuals that you don't really need. I don't want my tax money to go to some war in Ethiopia. And B, that's really bad because you're going to mess up IR tensions in a way that you wouldn't beforehand because countries, unlike most companies, have like pre-existing relationships that can be fucked up by suddenly engaging in war. This is the only alternative is crisis in this country. The bottom line here, yes, I watched the YouTube channel, is that everything relies on this and we need to secure it. Why is this crucial? Firstly, I want to point out that this is probably not going to be used in most cases. This is going to exist mainly as a deterrent to the people who see these vulnerable points in the supply chain and are desperate enough to try and make attempts on it, such as pirates, etc. We think this is going to deter fights if they're secure. I think the logic here is very intuitive. Secondly, why won't they over-militarize? I think A, because it's super expensive, like weapons aren't cheap, and B, because it's a PR nightmare if Amazon goes and kills some innocent people somewhere. Good luck, your business is going to tank anyways. I think companies are going to weigh the cost and benefits, and they're only going to do this if they're already strategically vulnerable to criminal attacks. Big companies such as mask shipping companies, etc. And we think they're not going to misuse it simply because the costs of fucking up are so incredibly high for these companies. With that out of the way, onto my second argument about why this is going to protect civilian workers on the ground. I want to make it clear, as we've said, this is likely to be the shipping industries, but also resource extraction industries. Note that these, to a very high degree, take place in countries with already unstable security institutions. Often there is no one available to protect workers working in these industries. These are unstable regions where stuff like piracy, terrorism, and organized crimes are relatively big risks. A, because people there are desperate enough to try it because of poverty, but also B, because there are no deterrent institutions in the status quo. I want to make it very clear here that the tangible harm to the workers in these industries, to the people who pilot your ships, to the people who extract your resources are incredibly high. They're going to lose their lives and they are feeling insecure in the very jobs that they have to take. In the status quo, they are not allowed to protect themselves because we don't allow this militarization. So if something, there are two scenarios here. If something happens, now these workers are able to protect themselves. Now someone will step in and make sure that they do not die, that they can still feed their families, that mass tragedy do not happen to these very vulnerable people. And if nothing happens, there's deterrence. These workers are going to feel a lot safer in these jobs that they're going to have anyways, and their families are going to worry a lot less. These companies are the only ones who can do this because A, they have the resources to do this, unlike local governments. B, they're already established in the region, so they have an overview of like, okay, what are the strategic points here that we need to protect? And they have an incentive to do this in a way that isn't directly harmful and in a way that isn't like going to stoke or like conflict with combatants in the region, etc. And C, they can protect throughout the whole supply chain here. We're protecting the most vulnerable. Why is this important? I think this is important because these huge companies have a duty to protect their workers who are currently working in difficult regions with no protection, where they are at risk every day. This is the only way they can do it. We're so proud to stand on government.
Great. I'd like to thank the speaker very much for a very fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to a leader of opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, POI is only in the chat, please. I get distracted if you do it by voice. And if I'm not acknowledging your POI in the chat, it means I'm reading it. I'm just not taking it exactly at that moment. Okay, 1 second. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Insofar as this is unlikely to be applicable to a large number of supply chains across the world, according to Prime Minister's characterization, the impact that they're highlighting is extremely limited, but the impact of the harms we're going to point out, even in the numerically few instances where this does apply, are going to be extremely problematic. The second thing I want to point out is that companies that are going to be relevant in this debate are the large companies, Apple, Amazon, have horizontal integration, i.e. they extract resources, process, manufacture, and then are also the retailers. So it is untrue that small businesses are necessarily going to be affected. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the characterization of these companies. And we obviously understand that they necessarily want profits for themselves, for their shareholders. But empirically, we want to point out that companies on occasion have done these sorts of things before, i.e. Coca-Cola has notoriously killed labor organizers in Colombia, but in opposition's world, you have the ability to hold them accountable because this is something that's illegal. This is a degree of public pressure and legal sanction that government bench removes. The first thing we're going to talk about is the kind of people that are necessarily going to be hired by these corporations. And notice, if government's whole case is that we want to defeat piracy and terrorism, you necessarily need to over militarize, i.e., and even if you don't, and sure, you don't need to drop nuclear weapons, but you're likely to have large standing forces, you're likely to have significant ammunition, significant militarization, at least enough to achieve any kind of sort of outcomes on government bench. The first thing that you are likely to do is that you are likely to hire military contractors or ex-personnel. The reason that you can't hire current army personnel, because it is illegal for current army personnel and generals who belong to national armies to join corporations and do work other than being part of the army. The problem with hiring military contractors, one, is that these people are likely have been ejected from their military for having been terrible people or just being extremely incompetent. These likely are individuals who are war hardened, who are rent seeking, who view these things as either like cushy retirement schemes, cushy money making schemes. The impact of this is that these individuals are far less competent, and they are also far less serious about executing this in a way that is reasonable and objective, and that is reasonable and pragmatic. The consequence of this is that you are likely to have accidental engagements. You are likely to end up killing people, even if your intentions are to challenge things like terrorism, etc. The proclivity towards collateral damage is far, far higher. There is also no accountability for these individuals. One, because the company that hired them doesn't want to hold them accountable, because that will be admitting that they have bad hiring processes and hired terrible people who are doing terrible things. But secondly, the countries from which these military contractors and ex-personnel are from are also not going to hold them accountable, because these operations are necessarily taking place in different countries than those that are the home countries of those citizens, and the country and the government of those military personnel are likely to dismiss responsibility towards the company or towards the country where these incidences are taking place. Let's then also talk about general accountability, and even in instances where this operation necessarily ends up happening. The reason it is extremely difficult to hold them accountable when something bad happens is because they're likely to register these organizations, their military armies in different jurisdictions, in different jurisdictions. For example, in international waters where there is extremely limited legal sanction on militarization. But secondly, register themselves in countries where there is weak law and order situation, which is also Prime Minister's characterization. Therefore, they have an ability to escape any kind of scrutiny and escape any kind of legal sanction. Also likely to do so in places where they are economically dominant or hold a large market share. Therefore, the government of that country is unable to hold them accountable because that company is so tied into the economy, into the job market of that country, and therefore the government cannot hold them accountable, because holding them accountable would be economically disastrous for them. And lastly, the characterization of this is important, because where does resource extraction take place usually? In most cases, resource extraction doesn't happen in major urban centers across the world. It happens in places where people are already poor. In more rural areas, they are relatively perhaps more isolated than other areas. The problem is that the people existing here already have very little ability to withstand any or generate any kind of accountability for these companies. Things like shareholders and reputation also are something government bench cannot run, given that the incentive of those shareholders are primary profit and they face no personal risk whatsoever. It is also likely that smaller incidents, given the fact that they are existing in more rural areas, are unlikely to face any kind of media scrutiny because they aren't happening in places that are visible. POI, closing government.
So if these are very poor countries and they're very dependent on it, and they have all this lobbying power, don't you think it's just really easy for Amazon to, I don't know, bribe a local police person to basically now take prison the unionists? It's very easy to still have all this power. It's
If your
uncomparative.
argument is that this characterization of relatively weak means that there is no delta, I just don't think that's true. I.e., in a world where you have a legal sanction against doing these kinds of things, where you have legal preventions, where you cannot militarize a company or you cannot buy a police organization, you have far greater capability of hold them accountable within international organizations, etc. When like companies are bad in either world, you let them be much more bad. The third thing that we're talking about local movements and how it is that you end up actually putting workers and the local population at far more risk than in the status quo. The first thing is that in instances where there is terrorism or piracy, where you have, let's say, local warlords or local groups that are waging, let's say, conflict over these resources, etc., you are likely to exacerbate that conflict. One, because you now have more ammunition within the company, and therefore the resources that you're fighting about far more, sort of the warlord or the terrorist group, etc., wants to fight your company more because now they can potentially steal that ammunition. But far more importantly, the costs of the company go up. They are likely to expand their militarization, likely to expand war, because necessarily their costs are going up because of the conflict that happens. The fact that the local warlord or the local group has more local support and sort of a local network means that the company cannot necessarily succeed very easily and will therefore have to amp up the level of conflict that happens. This makes it far worse for workers in their world. But secondly, and more importantly, the vast amounts of resource extraction happens in situations where there is an indigenous group or a local group of civilians whose resources are being extracted from their land in ways that are asymmetric, given power asymmetric, like through context of power asymmetric. The problem is they already have very limited ability to protect their resources or to talk to the government and speak about why their resources are being extracted unfairly. Therefore, they are likely to have to resort to things like public protest. The problem with government is that they give legal sanction for these companies to attack and to violently crack down on those kinds of protests, because they now can label those as terrorists who are affecting and hurting their supply chain. More indigenous people die. These companies are not good at what they're going to be doing. Very proud to oppose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for that very fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister to continue our today's debate. Here.
Hey, I hope I'm still audible. I take my POIs in the chat, please. I think OO has a nice case if the comparative here is just safety for everyone involved and there isn't actually any like serious threats to any of these companies, right? If the comparative is just, oh, we just don't do nothing and then everything would be great, that sounds like a nice case on opposition, but I think they have to actually engage with what the situation looks like. Lucky for us, the biggest shipping company in the world is actually Danish. So let me tell you a little bit about what it means for the majority of shipping companies worldwide to actually live under this threat constantly. Let me tell you how often it is that we have to hear in the media that another masked ship has been attacked by pirates outside of the African coast, right? These are not serious or instances that we just never hear about, that the media would never want to talk about. Because for us, this feels like Danish people who are somewhere else in the world who are being threatened because they're doing a job that we find very crucial to social infrastructure, to global infrastructure, to anything that we want to do and to accelerate any kind of growth within the economy. Any kind of social change is dependent upon these people. We see these people as very important workers who actually go out there and do a job that is crucial not just to us as individuals or to the Danish shareholders or whatever it may be, but to society overall, to global communities overall, right? That is a threat that is constant here. And look, the comparative here, or the actual case here, is not necessarily militarized groups on the ground between these piracies, right? Like, these people are not severely sophisticated in the way that they're doing warfare. The difference here is just they have weapons, they want to use them. Danish companies or other companies worldwide don't have weapons and are not allowed to use them. So it's a very different power asymmetry here. We don't need to be extremely like militarized to the extent that we are at the same level as like the US Army in order to like fight off these pirates. We literally just need to have some sort of weaponry, some sort of people in militarized like military clothes in order to deter, right? So we think the tipping balance is actually quite small on our side of the house. I think that's very important to understand here, that when you talk about, oh, how you're just going to go over there and you're going to escalate a serious tons of conflicts, these conflicts are only there because these people have guns and are willing to use them, not because they're super criminals or like super criminal masterminds that have so much infantry that they can just do whatever the hell they want. That's not the scenario here. Why do we think it's actually justified to talk specifically about shipping? We think shipping and like resource extraction companies are the most vulnerable and they're the most frequently attacked because they operate in the situation or like in the countries, in the areas that are so significantly more vulnerable, but also more corrupt and like just have more of these what do you call them, criminals that are rising, right? But also because they're so interlinked with the rest of society, exactly as Martha tells you. So when OO tries to say that we have limited impacts, I think that's literally just OO not listening to the case. What else do they tell us? Well, they tell us we have no accountability. How do we respond to this, right? I think first of all, you get more accountability than outside once you make this legal, because that means you also have to treat them as an entity as you would any other like military force. If a Danish military leader goes out and does something illegal, they're scrutinized much more heavily because they are now under the like perception of being involved in a legal army, because they have some sort of reason to be there, because we put extra trust in these people to do something good. That is why we're so much more able to scrutinize them. But note, even if you don't think that's true, that we're actually able to take criminal or like military
criminals to court. That is the comparative on both sides of the house, right? Because the alternative here is not that we do nothing. The alternative is that local governments will now send their military to these places to fight these crimes out on behalf of other companies. So if you don't think that there's accountability on either side, or like on that side, then there's no accountability on the counterfactual either. So opposition has no claim in that sense. So we think it's much easier for them to be accountable. But even more so, they tell us like, oh, no one really cares about the shareholders, and the media doesn't really care as well either. I think it's just intuitively untrue that the media wouldn't care about like if a company goes to war, or like if a company is actively involved in a armed combat. I think that's very relevant news that a lot of us would probably care about. I think people that are interested in the stock market would care about this immensely. But I also think just saying that shareholders are never held accountable is extremely untrue. We see boards and people being in charge being fired all the time. So I don't think any of the mechanisms that they provide to us on no accountability is that important. But even so, I think even if you believe that there is no accountability, you have to weigh this with the safety arguments that Martha tells you, both on the safety, like perceived safety of the actual workers, but also on the safety in terms of like global supply chains and how we function around these. The only other thing that I think we get out of opening opposition is the sense that we are going to have to hire people who aren't really that good at their job. They're less competent, less serious, and they're going to provide accidental damage. Great. So if I can tell you that we'll probably just hire people and have an incentive to hire people that are really good at their job, and that these people exist, then this argument isn't really that valid for them. Why is it possible for us to hire people like that, or hire good people? Why does these people exist?
Why?
First and foremost, I think we're able to give them better pay than you are in like a local military ranking system, right? So I think just saying that it's illegal for you to not be in your own military is a statement that I don't recognize, especially not in like Danish military laws. Okay, so I think these people are very possible to get, but even more so, note that we've already analyzed or like told you specifically why it is that the people that they're fighting are not that sophisticated in the way that they're doing crimes. So you don't have to have significantly more competent military personnel. You don't have to have them at the standards of the US military league. No, thank you, a non-rebel, please. Yeah, so I think you're just going to be fine in that sense, because you can just hire like security forces and now allow them to wear military gear and allow them to like armor up in the right senses. Before I'll go on, I'll take one from closing if they have anything.
Yeah,
Alright.
so if these are not that complicated, then I don't know why you just can't have a state to provide these kinds of resourcing. I don't know why you need to actively militarize if the threats that you have are just a bunch of pirates who are very easy for you to take down.
Great. When I say very easy for us to take down, that doesn't mean that I could do it, right? Like, let's be very clear here. When I say it's easy to take down, this still means you need people who are actually trained and can do something. Note the Danish military has just other things to do than track around any freight ship in the world. The difference here is that the economy of what it costs to do these things. The companies have a serious stake and incentive on providing the amount of resources that it costs for them, because this makes them feel more secure. This is a like serious investment in securing their supply chains. This is something that makes sense for them economically. It doesn't make sense economically for the Danish states to go around and do these things, but even more so, it's difficult to persuade like Danish voters or Danish politicians that you have to be okay with sending a large majority of your military somewhere else in the world when there are so many more proximate fights that you would rather have those people fighting, right? We already know that there's a lack of military personnel in terms of like sending people to Ukraine, etc. So why should we take them out of something to put them here? Note also the difference here in like the mentality of the workers who are on the ground, right? You need them to feel safe. Society owes them some level of safety because they are so crucial to because they are so crucial to our everyday lives, because their jobs influence all. I feel like we owe them, or I think it's very reasonable for us to owe them that level of safety. So that means they have to be with them. It is not enough to say that, oh, if you like run into a pirate tomorrow, we'll just ship over someone in a helicopter and they'll be there within the first 12 hours. That doesn't make them feel safe, and that also doesn't deter the pirates. So if we do it that way, we just don't have any of the impacts, and I just don't think that's relevant. So that's already the status quo. It doesn't work. On our side of the house, we want to protect the workers. We want to protect global supply chains. I think you give you a reasonable case. Please engage with that. Don't try to scroll the motion further down. Very proud to propose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue their side in today's debate. Here.
Hi, am I audible? Oh, perfect. So POIs in the chat, please just write them down. I will take you whenever I can. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things. Firstly, will this secure global supply chains? And secondly, will you be protecting civilians and any spillover violence and accountability? On supply chains, in the status quo, there are international warships by the US, by China, that guard and protect important corridors around like the South China Sea, across the Gulf, in the Red Sea and all that. Those are literal warships that protect you against piracy. So one is I'm problematizing the need where they say that, oh, there is so much like piracy happening that every company's shipment is being threatened and being stolen away. I don't think that's true. Generally, most international shipping is quite secure. I don't necessarily understand the need or the perpetual need to aggressively militarize. Secondly, also companies are protected by this by global shipping insurance, right? They insure their shipments that go through international waters, and in cases of loss, they're protected against this. I don't think it necessarily works when you say that, oh, there's so much financial risk associated here, and that risk is appropriately converted into the kind of national shipping, global shipping insurance that you have to pay, which is a legal requirement, and you do that anyways, right? And thirdly, we don't think that Gov can cop out here and be like, oh, we're going to protect against pirates and terrorists, but then also say, oh, no, it's not that complicated, just small incidents. We will just have some guards. I don't necessarily think it's symmetric in the sense that that they're changing anything, because even in status quo, companies do have small scale guards, which does not necessarily qualify as militarization. If you run a manufacturing plant at a particular place, you have a guard from a private company at your gate with maybe a gun or maybe not a gun, right? When you have a ship, you have one security officer. In a goddamn plane, you have a US air marshal sitting in there. There is a guard that usually is there, right? So it cannot be that we will have a guard and that will protect us. It needs to be something comparatively different. And sure, it not aggressively militarizing like you will have like nukes and all, but it needs to be a greater 5-10 people with actual ammunition to actually push back against you being able to actually access any of the benefits that you have contextualized, be it pirates who are trying to attack your ship, or be it like local militias that are trying to steal resources from your plant. It doesn't matter if it's 5-10 people, but the fact that they're with guns and they're trying to steal your resources, you need to have minimum level of firepower to push it back, and that is the context. The only thing that they say in our argument that they are going to make the global supply chains insecure because of accidents and all, they say, oh, no, we will pay like them more wages, but they don't engage with our mechanistic reasoning. But I will add on to this. We don't think that these private companies are going to be paying really good wages compared to the other competitors in the market. Your profit maximizing, profit incentivized. If you pay lots and lots of wages to global security practitioners, your cost of production, your cost of shipping increases so much, it's really tough for you to be able to maintain profitability. So you have an incentive to hire like cheap military contractors. But who are the other competitors who currently hire private military contractors? The US government and militaristic, like the Chinese government, the Russian government. And you know what? They pay them fucking a lot of money, and B, also guarantee these military contractors no accountability because it exposes war crimes and dubious acts of these governments directly. So they have an incentive. They provide them protection and pay them really great wages, right? And what is their primary incentive? To wage war, and they pay a wage proportional to that incentive. Your primary incentive to protect your particular shipment, we don't think you can pay a comparative wage that is equivalent to someone else paying you to literally wage war. For you to be able to pay that wage, that significantly overthrows your cost, which that means you're not going to be able to do so. So you will hire cheap military contractors, you will hire ex-military, washed up ex-military personnel who are going to do a shitty job. Even if they're good actors, we think accidents will happen. And that brings me on to this whole thing about like now they're military actors and we can hold them accountable. That brings me on to the second discussion on protecting civilians, spillover, and accountability. They say that, but now we can hold them accountable because now we know they have guns. Realize that now the fact that they are allowed to militarize, they're allowed to have guns, that creates a bit of a smoke screen or a fuzzy environment around the kind of engagements that do happen. It's unclear now when the company fired against other people that it was necessarily an act of self-defense, or was that an aggressive act of attacking a particular area. How is this clear in the model of the opposition? Because in a world where the company does not militarize, we think that it is obviously apparent in a world where Coca-Cola or any company is able to kill people or able to engage in conflict because they need not be allowed to do so. But in a world where they're allowed to do so, quite simply and logically it makes sense that there's a fuzzy environment that they engaged in this in self-defense. Secondly, they say, how will states, this is something that CG pushes from the POI, how will states hold them accountable? Oh my God, because of these companies having so much influence. look, the comparative is if you're operating in a relatively unstable or a stressy environment, such as like a mine in Africa or a mine in like Asia and whatnot, we think that the mechanism that currently exists for governments to hold you accountable is to increase your taxes, to sort of put a court order on you, demand you show up in court. But we think those mechanisms, while being weak, become even more weak, because now not only do you need a democratic and like a press mechanism, but you need a physical mechanism, because now this company has a militaristic military force, a very physical force that you need to unseat. And the fact that they have a physical force, that also means that they exert more negotiation and persuasive power over the state, in the sense that they're able to control the security environment around the plant, around the area within which their plant operates. But before I go on, I'll take a POI from CG.
So if the US and Russia like give free rein for war crimes for military, and therefore a lot of people join them, why is it so good for these countries to now have US interventions leading to more war crimes in these regions?
That's just that's not fair in the argument that I'm making. The US presence and multilateral protections in terms of shipping exist in international global waters. I am not talking about the US or anyone intervening in these markets. The comparative is that generally these company and organizations are able to maintain a level of operation that is broadly secure. If you add more military forces there, your civilian workers and the area becomes more insecure. That brings me on to the third point in terms of how these workers are perceived. We think in a world where a company or a plant in a physical location has military operators, guns and ammunition, that makes them more of a target for pirates and other militias, because now you have an extra resource other than money that they want to take over, which is your guns and ammunitions that they can take up. But B, they also feel threatened. For a militia or a pirate trying to wrest over control over the country, now you are an extra military threat in addition to the national government. That means that they will also make you more of a target than you previously were. Previously, these companies could bribe them, negotiate with them, and continue their operations because they are able to employ people. They are able to employ people from the militia, give them money and bribes, and that makes them work fine. But now when you have military, you are more of a threat. They might attack you, and which is why please vote opening opposition.
Great. I thank that speaker very much for a very fine speech and for a very nice top half. Bringing in the member of government to open the bottom half in today's debate. Here.
I'm just going to do an audibility check, not just in sense of like you hear me, but also continue to talk quickly, because my headphones don't always pick up when I talk quickly. So was that audible?
Yeah,
Great.
yes, it was.
Okay, by the way, for PYs, please have them in the chat. Don't interrupt me. I don't like that. Okay. And I think OG falls out of debate at the moment that they talk about, for example, their economy argument, the idea that you're going to actually have cheaper supply chains and all stuff. They themselves say you're going to spend a lot of money on like the war things. And I think it's fair to point out that the extra benefit that you get seems to be marginal. At that point, the only thing standing from OG is the idea that you might actually have some prevention. But I want to know that it's significantly underbacked and you just have some lights on it, but they don't really actually explain how you resolve these issues and why you solve them. That's the unique contribution and the pact for victory from CG. So what are we going to do? So firstly, I'm actually going to explain how you're actually going to stop fighting, because I think overall there are two specific problems in these countries where you actually have these supply chain problems. Firstly, I just often want to know that there are just underinvested and neglected regions, specifically in the rural sites. That's oftentimes why they join, for example, piracy groups, because they oftentimes have no capacity to create jobs otherwise. Note, oftentimes this is also near where the resource extraction is, as O fairly points out. That's to say, mines, for example, are oftentimes not in major cities because it's like just really bad to build there. It's mainly expensive, but oftentimes are just in different places. Therefore, a lot of the extraction is therefore near these rural regions. Secondly, I also want to note that these rebel groups often specifically target these economic things. So yes, some of them is indeed just going attacking ships, but that I think is quite hard. It's easier to just, attack a specific mine and therefore extract the resources, because it's just more on the ground. You don't have those international water problems that OO talks about, and you basically are more likely to do this. Note that oftentimes this is used to basically, for example, mine these diamond mines and therefore just use this money to then fund these rebel groups, all this stuff, which basically then perpetuates these groups and making them stronger. So what is then the alternative if we don't actually give them money to come? I want to know that oftentimes these countries are already going to be spread thin. That is to say that the moment you have rebel groups within your country, it is very difficult to fight them in rural areas because it's inherently spread out and you don't have a centralized force that you can get against. But I also want to note, oftentimes refugees specifically come to cities because that's where it's always relatively safe. That's where you have more police, and we have more resources, all this stuff. Therefore, oftentimes the military force and the money specifically goes towards cities and not rural areas. But I also want to note there's another problem here, right? Politicians oftentimes live in cities in the first place and they want to protect themselves. Therefore, they're much more likely to also have more investment in security there because they directly want to actually save themselves. That means that oftentimes they are spread thin and they're more likely to actually put this money within this. Therefore, they actually basically limit the capacity for themselves to actually fight these regions there. So second thing. We also want to note that because there are going to be more refugees there, if there is some form of accountability, either via international relationships or news or backlash or like, the fact that your country is democratically represented, it's oftentimes worse to actually not help these people in these cities, which is why it's inherently incentive to basically put your money in these cities compared to these rural areas, even if it might be fighting the root cause. What's then the other problem, right? So at that point, you might decide, okay, we need to quell these rebels. What do? You do what kind of like happens before, specifically in Africa. You hire, for example, you ask like, for example, France or England or former people who've colonized you like, hey, you fucked us up. Can you basically give us military help? Or you ask like for China, hey, can you help us? We can make some economic concessions. What is then the problem with this? One, I want to know that these countries oftentimes have more things that they care about than just your protecting your economy. That's to say, the company basically wants to have infrastructure being stable, wants to have workers being alive, and wants to extract resources. Those are things that are still in the interest of your country because they still pay taxes. They still give you like benefits, right? So they need to build a healthcare center because their workers are sick, but it also helps non-workers. You also have more roads, which means it's easier for people to actually travel, all this stuff. But countries have other incentives, like voting in them in the UN, or actually not only just helping one company, just Amazon, but actually multiple companies that are from their country, or giving you more concessions where they basically say, oh, if you're unable to actually pay back or you're unable to fight them, we're going to take your port, as China is doing, which means they oftentimes have more power over you, and now we have more incentives to fuck you over. But I also want to note, at the moment, you have these countries, as OO says, with a military complex, who is going to lobby these governments. They are very likely to not actually invest things well. That is to say, oftentimes countries hire other groups to actually fight for them because it's not that nice to actually have people from your country die, which is why you actually have paramilitary groups being hired by these companies as like also to certain highlights. At that point, they oftentimes want to make a shit ton of money. How do you make a shit ton of money? Unnecessarily using tanks, using military, using guns. That is why they, for example, when a car just kind of breaks down, they oftentimes just, light it on fire and just buy a new car because that makes more money for the military complex, which means oftentimes they have the incentive to continue the war, but also continue the war in a bad way and an inefficient way, therefore leading to more civilian casualties, mental harm. Now you might say, but there's going to be backlash. But panel, intuition pump. Who actually knows what is happening in Africa right now and what actually knows how many harms are being done by the military groups? I think people have more proximate needs in these countries, such as the living cost rises, the fact that inflation is high, all of this stuff, which means that they're unlikely to really care about what other countries are doing, especially when there's oftentimes also cover-ups by the media, as OO already highlights themselves, that you have them free reign to do war crimes. I think at that point, companies actually don't have that incentive to be actually that bad and to not actually solve these problems. And therefore, we think we already basically win on that comparative. Quickly, OO.
Engage with the large number of scenarios where indigenous people are trying to protect their resources and their environment from these extractive companies, and the companies choose to label them violent and shoot them down with no accountability.
Okay, look, in the comparative, where they are indigenous groups, they're going to be small and they don't actually have access to high weapons. In these specific cases, it is very likely that you're able to use the government and use the police anyway, because it's not fixed. These are oftentimes in larger tension areas where you have larger groups. At the moment, there are larger groups, they oftentimes have more guns and they oftentimes have more tech, at which point they aren't just vulnerable indigenous groups, they are just terrorist organizations who are still harming people and still killing them. Just because they are indigenous doesn't mean it's fair for them to continue killing people. Okay, to that extent, why are you actually able to solve this? Because I think basically OG says here, you can hire paramilitary groups and they're good, and OO says, but governments can do this anyway. Why is it that specifically companies are then good? One, know that they can actually have access to things like as high tech, such as drones, better tracking systems, and this kind of stuff. Whereas on the comparative, you often specifically need these countries to actually give that. E.g., oftentimes the US is willing to give you weapons, but only if you make specific concessions, whereas these companies can just more directly buy them. But I also want to note that oftentimes you can just have more experience, right? That's to say, oftentimes it's about the organizational side, it's about the size, the idea that you're able to use tactics better. And at the moment, you have people who have had experience with doing this in different supply chains because they are big companies, and you oftentimes are able to kind of like do this specifically in the long term, where there's some form of competition, because if you're going to be more effective, you're able to actually have a better company and therefore grow more. You're better able to actually do this and actually expect. Then what do we actually solve? One, I think we actually explain why it is likely for you to have unique sectors that are going to be safe, and where you specifically have the capacity to do so because you just have better tech. But I also want to know we actually highlight why this prevents harm, right? Because now these groups who would normally join, for example, these piracy groups are more likely to either work in these mines or in some way be hired as a paramilitary force, or to be able to, I don't know, build these fences in the first place and all of this stuff. Which means that we actually make it less likely and give them an alternative for them to actually go into, because it's also more secure, it's more safe, because you don't have these groups attacking them. But I also want to note that prevention of harm is often more important than maybe giving something a bit more salmon. That's to say, at the moment, never mind, I'll just move away. Vote CG.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a very fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the extension speaker from side closing opposition to open their side in today's debate. Here.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
We always had more choices than just moving to spilling blood. We're going to tell you two things from closing opposition. First, what the alternatives to these policies are, why they're likely to be effective, and why getting rid of them is a massive harm. But second, why it is the case that private military contractors are actively harmful even when they act in the good and intended ways, and they aren't just rogue, as opening opposition claims quite uncharitably. Let's talk about what the alternatives are to this policy. I think there's two. First, building resilience into your supply chains. What do I mean by this? Oftentimes, this is a problem that exists because companies are going to one place to try and get a resource. That is, you want lithium from the Congo at really low cost, and you want to scale up the extraction of lithium, so you're sinking lots and lots of money into being able to establish new mines and consolidating control over the mines in the Congo. In absence of this policy, you have to instead diversify across a variety of different jurisdictions to source your resources. You would get lithium from, you go to get lithium from like Bolivia and Rwanda instead. It might be slightly more expensive to extract there, instead of trying to monopolize extraction in the Congo at a flat low cost, but it means that you now shift the spending of money into getting resources from 5 places instead of into one place where you would need a military contract. Why is there a trade-off here? First, money. It costs you massive amounts of money as like a tech company to militarize. There's massive sunk costs associated with you doing the kinds of hiring of PMCs, for example, dealing with the liability associated with this. And so that means that once you've committed, it means that you've decided that we need to do this. We need to consolidate the extraction that's going to happen in the Congo. And so therefore you are trading off your ability to diversify your supply chain across other different nations. But second, capacity. That is, firms have limited litigators, limited supply chain planners. When they are coordinating and working with the development of literal military resources as a tech company with that level of liability that you've never interacted with before, you cannot do that while also establishing new supply chain relationships in foreign states and diversifying and building points of resilience within your supply chain, like more dry ports or more accurate stock tracking to scale extraction and production to demand, and local warehousing systems to stop shortages. Why would the comparative be good? First, I think resilience is just a good thing for us to have. Shocks can happen at any time. A political crisis can happen in Congo that you did not control. A drought can happen that you do not control. Being able to have a diverse set of options and putting yourself across a variety of different jurisdictions is a good way for you to be able to protect from those things. And we would rather have that, even if it makes goods like 10% more expensive. But second, I think that these things are far more peaceful, not only because you're not incentivizing as much conflict, but because lower payloads in the individual extraction, that is, if your ship has less like minerals on it, for example, means that the payoff of piracy is lower relative to the cost of you getting caught, versus if it's not, versus if you have bigger payloads, you would rather take the risk because the payday is going to be so big. The second alternative is that states have their own militaries. I would first note that they have the incentive to do this kind of protection, because not only is it the case that you do not want to lose trade and extraction rents from scaring off firms or making it too expensive by making them pay out lots of things like risk pay, but also you want other firms to scale up operation within your country, so you have incentives to put lots and lots of money into the military. But I would also note that you have capacity. In Angola, they have a military that can provide securing on this. Yes, some states are very poor, but given their alternative is losing their most vital trade, politicians, military actors who support the state, like warlords or junta power holders, will protect the ports and the roads and the highways. Even in Somalia, one of the most militarized nations in the world, their ports are remarkably safe, and they were able to massively cull piracy. Why is this good? First, the essential protection necessary to make sure that the worst excesses of government bench already are avoided already occurs. Second, given in many resource extractive states like the post-independence MPLA in Angola, we have pseudo-military governance, right? If you are reliant on the state to support you in a protective manner, you need to function with them and cooperate. That means that they have a force of leverage over you, and so we have accountability over companies, and we prevent abuses in cases where it may be harmful. Can we please use only the chat for POIs? What does this do to the debate? First, GovBench is not necessary. If the alternative they prop leads to larger and more endemic harms, then you should weigh that massively within the debate that we'll talk about. But second, they're already trading off economic resilience for the sake of protecting a supply chain. On their side, you still only need one point of failure, a drought, a political crisis, things that you cannot control to fuck over your lithium supply or your cobalt supply so you can't make medicine or cars anymore. So we would much rather have the resilience that comes from diversification on our side of the house, because it means that we're far more likely to be able to get people the cars and the medicines that they need. Second argument on private military contractors being harmful. OO says that these PMCs are bad because they're military rejects. First, we think they're far worse than this structurally, i.e. we can fix the problems that OO flags with better hiring. We're going to show you far more endemic problems. But second, OO relies on them being hard to control. We're going to show you why they're bad even when they act as intended. 4 reasons. First, they're overly aggressive because they're militarized into over responses. This is either one, they often do things like scorched earth policies, like going in and doing things like large massacres to begin with, like the Blackwater massacre in Iraq. Because if they do one massacre, then that means that people will not mess with them again and are too scared of this. And so therefore that means that they will do this and they already have a propensity towards abuses. But second, they're oftentimes already in conflict. For example, private military contractors supported the People's Front of Liberation for Congo in exchange for extraction contracts in the DRC. So therefore, they have existing harmful ties and they respond aggressively, or other groups will just attack them immediately by association. The reason you have to choose them is because you as a company have no alternative but the strongest PMC, like the Wagner Group or Executive Outcomes, because most companies aren't going to just train up their own militaries. They will take the only company that can provide them with the essential protection. The comparative to this is states who are far better at doing things like negotiating things like power sharing or ceasefire agreements with individual groups, because they have leverage to give a group that they want what they want. See the M23 group signing a peace agreement with the Congolese government. Second, it's impossible to decide whether private security or military companies are recognized by combatants under things like the Geneva Convention. At best, the employees of PMCs can be prosecuted individually on the basis of responsibilities for war crimes, which are notoriously difficult to prosecute, and the ambiguity of their status can lead to the conclusion of immunity agreements between PNCs and the contracting states, and even if this isn't true, this is the precedent that they act upon. Third, they undermine the power of a sovereign state, right? You're pulling manpower, weapons, and intelligence from the same pool as the state. So that means that while you may be protecting one company's supply chain better, you do so at the cost of making the state military worse, adding another actor to the conflict that can oftentimes incentivize more action against them. And more importantly than anything else, you also just are going to undermine the power of the state, because it means that their ability to do the baseline things like protecting the ports and being able to build in things like resilience within their militaries, building in better intelligence at 630, Piotr, is just not going to be able to happen. And so you undermine them significantly. But fourth, you have an ability to blackmail the state with guns on your side to get deals when you want them. This is extracting minerals from the Congo without any accountability with low rents, versus at least on the comparative when you're dependent on the rent, the state can do things against you. Why are all of these things harmful? First, I think we've already proven to you that the likelihood of abuses, because of the level of power that these companies have, is not only very likely, but very, very harmful when they do occur. Second, it increases the cost of these things because these companies create a set of scenarios that demand their use even more by stoking more conflict. Third, in situations where you need to protect more, like in Congo, where there's many conflicting rebel groups like the M23 fighting, you make enemies with them and incentivize attacks against you. This is by nature of taking the side of one actor in protection, you incentivize action against you. But last, I just don't think it's justified to have cheaper or faster medicine at the cost of making the lives of people in one state more dangerous by funding military action against them. Vote closing opposition.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a very fine speech. For the recording and everyone in the debate, I kicked out the observer not based on what they said, but because they wrote in the channel. If you're at my tournament, you're not screwing with my participants. If you have a problem with that, don't come. So yeah, just to clear it off. With that said, I'd like to invite the government whip to end the government bench in today's debate. Hear, hear.
Am I audible and visible? Fabulous. I'll take POIs in chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The reason why Pyotr's extension wins this debate because it actually delineates the comparative. The comparative isn't a world where companies and corporations and the government actors that are involved don't do anything. It's where it's these government actors and its armies that directly involve themselves in protecting these supply chains, directly involve themselves in protecting these rebel groups or negotiating with them. We think that incentives that the government has is far more pernicious, means that you get less efficacy and less safety for participants on the ground. I'm going to first respond to CG independently, then I'm going to weigh our argument, and then I'm going to resolve this in relation to top half. Responding to closing opposition, I think there's two primary pushes. The first on alternatives, and secondly, why PMCs are harmful. Firstly, on alternatives. The first alternative they say is that you're more likely to build resilience onto your supply chain. One, I think this is symmetric. Companies already have incentives to provide contingencies in order to prevent future harms in the first place, insofar as your supply chains are quite vulnerable. Insofar as you know that your confidence in the market is quite shaky, that's why you want to protect your supply chains in the first place, irrespective of whether you're able to militarize or not. So you have things like looking at other third-party suppliers or looking at insurance that you can get for your supply chains in the first place. I don't think this incentive for it to do contingencies disappear. Second, you don't want to be dependent on one country insofar as they can leverage you or take away your concessions in order to bargain specific deals with you, which means you want to have backup suppliers in case one country or one company that you interact with goes rogue. The third, you care about resilience. Wadi already says that you want to be resistant to shocks that happen. If this is true, this incentive is symmetrically true, which means that you want to be prepared against these shocks in the first place. You care about resilience within your supply chain, so you have contingencies in the first place. I think what this means is that supply chains that diversification exists on our side. The push here that they might exist to a lesser extent insofar as there is a resource time trade-off. I'm not sure why this is the case. Insofar as there's massive incentives to diversify and make your supply chains more resilient either way, I don't know why this money would come out of the same pot. Presumably you have additional money that's set aside specifically for contingencies. You're not setting your foot in that budget either way. Also, companies are worth billions and billions of dollars or euros or pounds, which means there's likely an incentive to do this in the first place. And the second thing they say is that militaries have a high capacity to do terrible things. I think the issue is that the comparative is that the militaries are political. They're likely run by the government insofar as the government uses them in more corrupt states to entrench power and to do things like suppress freedoms and rights, which means the degree of harm that these militaries are able to perpetuate is a lot higher because they have limited accountability insofar as they have they have more of an ability to use maximum force if that meets the government's endeavors. But second, I think if military personnel are corrupt, they're equally corrupt as either way. If they have militarization and violent incentives that exist symmetrically, then they say PMCs are harmful for a lot of reasons. I want to respond to each reasons. They say they're overly aggressive and military responses are vile. I think firstly, we proved that this is an unlikely scenario. Rather, these are situations where you just need to guard ports. But second, I think there's competition between PMCs, between Blackwater and the Wagner Group, which means that there's likely to be a push not to be the most terrible military, insofar as you still want companies buying into you in the first place. Second, they say that there's existing harmful ties. I think the comparative is that you have the government, which the terrorist groups are more likely to be oppositional to, which means you're unlikely to do good things, and it's harder to hold states accountable when it comes to the Geneva Convention and the things that they talk about. Why then is our extension more powerful than this? Piotr tells you about what incentives that countries and companies uniquely have. He says that countries care about other things, whereas the incentives of governments are far more political. That means that they want to make political concessions, that they have other interests in mind. Likely because they're sovereign governments, the way closing opposition says, you have less of an ability to hold them accountable because they control things like media institutions within their states. But there's more incentives here, right? Because governments want to resolve political uprisings rather than preserving that single supply chain the way that companies do. So they're likely to try to play the political game and whatnot, and they're likely to gamify politics between these groups. But they have electoral incentives and flashy policies. So they likely want to be invested. They likely want to say to their populace that they've done good things. All this means is that this flips the incentives that come out from opposition bend. We have states doing these things where they have likely a more flashy incentives. They're likely to do things that are far more pernicious in the long run or far more pernicious in the short run as well, whereas corporations at least have the capacity to preserve a smaller supply chain and preserve that root within itself. This is already winning because of capital, you need to preserve that smaller chain, and the political concessions that you engage in are a lot smaller in comparison with what the government needs to do, which means that Piotr is already able to prove efficiency. What this means is the impact that Piotr talks about, where you have more resilient routes insofar as there's less of a barrier to engage with these things in the first place. Your lives are much safer insofar as you don't have the government and its unchecked military engaging in like the worst possible responses insofar as their objective is to take down the terrorists. and not to preserve these supply chains, which is what companies care about in the first place. How does this compare against our opening government? A couple of things. Firstly, this proves safety better than opening government does, because their two mechanisms are here as follows. Firstly, deterrence. I don't know why deterrence is a sufficient incentive. Presumably, a lot of sanctions have been deployed against terrorist groups. I don't know why deterrence then becomes a tipping point. But second, on protecting workers, I don't think this only means that you have personnel there to protect workers in the first place, but Piotr shows you why there's a knock-on effect and a long-termist effect that the violence gets better insofar as now you have lesser situations in terms of frequency for workers to be harmed in the first place. In relation to the strategy that OG deploy in terms of weighing against efficacy, I think OO is right that you need that the efficacy within supply chains is quite marginal. Note that the OG's impacts have a marginal effect because you require efficacy for these impacts to activate. Piotr explains why you achieve much better efficacy on our side insofar as you have a greater ability for companies to do this in a better way, which means that you don't have to do things like engage in vast political concessions with terrorist groups, but rather you can work out a way to just preserve that supply chain as a whole and don't have to deal with the push for terrorist groups against these governments who they see as oppositional to. I'll take opening opposition.
Protests against corporations' unfair practices are empirically quite frequent. These corporations, because of faraway locations and underpaid staff, are likely to deal with these by shooting people down because of having no democratic or political.
Yeah, but I don't think the trade-off in this debate is that governments or like companies are both perfectly accountable. Is that the degree of accountability is quite different insofar as it's hard to hold the government accountable in its own turf, insofar as it can control the media narratives, control the army, and control the political concessions that happen here. In relation to opening opposition, they say that the accountability is far more difficult insofar as these militarization pushes exist. Note that I already respond to this from closing opposition, which is the far more stronger argument. But note that regulation against these companies probably gets better, right? Because insofar as now you have the ability to literally weaponize and militarize within these states, there's a greater push for domestic governments who control these corporations to do this in a good way or have regulation insofar as you have literally have the ability to harm civilians in other states. So you're more incentive for this. But second, insofar as companies need to justify this to their shareholders because it's a massive move, you have more ability to have internal accountability within the first place. I think the POI that we get from them about like indigenous groups is probably symmetrics, that the government doesn't have the incentive to do this either way. And corporate incentives always beat out governmental incentives, which means you have more of an ability to protect groups on our side of the house. Proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for that very fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the opposition whip to end today's debate. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me and see me?
Can you say it again? Because you cut off at least on my end.
Oh, okay, let me get closer to that thing. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think now you're okay. Yeah.
Yeah, is it good? Okay, 1 sec. I'm just gonna open this up. I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to talk about the comparative. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the harms of PMCs. First thing on the comparative, the first thing I want to do is deal with the case from closing government. So the closing government case is that the alternative is that you're going to have countries hiring PMCs in order to fight the same rebel groups. The question that you should be probably asking is why wouldn't they do that anyway? Like, if there is this rebel group that is attacking the minds of some MNC, they presumably don't do just that, right? Like, if it's this terrorist group or like this rebel group, they probably don't only attack MNCs. They only probably also doing things against the government, right? And CG's analysis themselves is like the country's PMCs are bad because they also want to do other things like take down the terrorists. So unless they are claiming that this is going to be Amazon's PMCs also co-functioning as like a Angola's military force, presumably, if the country has rebels and has those incentives to be taking on those rebels, they also hire their own contractors. So you would still have, on their side, you would have the PMCs hired by the government, also PMCs hired by Amazon to protect mines. All of them are doing bad things. CG implicitly kind of concedes why PMCs are bad. So this just makes no sense.
Second thing, they say that the local population gets jobs because you hire them as PMCs, and this is good. First, I'm not sure why you would possibly do that. As like you have to train some random Angolese farmer. I think this is costly, unreliable. If anything, probably feeds into opening opposition's analysis about why those PMCs will be rogue that we are not actually dependent on, but it's a bad thing for CG. What is then the actually comparative? Opening government says that there are threats to some of these companies, the most vulnerable Danish resource contractors. Importantly, as a strategic note, the comparative analysis that we are giving is not just mitigation. It is explaining that the comparatives are actively better and trading them off causes harms. Opening opposition does have some decent analysis, fair mitigation, such as we have insurance. We are adding and we are taking it further. What are then these comparatives? The first thing that we point out is that it discourages diversification, which is that it is very expensive to diversify supply chains and source from different sources. And it's also expensive to militarize, which creates a trade-off. Closing governments gives a bunch of reasons about why companies still have an incentive to diversify their supply chains. We agree, like probably those incentives exist. The issue that we are finding with it is that obviously there is a big monetary trade-off, which is the outcome of that is either you just preference the incentive to diversify and you don't invest into the PMCs and the militarization, in which case Gov has no impact. But if they do choose to militarize, then it does create a trade-off, which is either it slows down the diversification because you need to be investing substantial amount of money into doing the militarization, or it trades off if actually opening other avenues of diversification at all. They say like that they have different money pots. Like they still have limited money that they are having. They say it's billions and billions. But I would just want to note, like, diversification, opening a different supply chain and building resilience costs billions and billions. Those are expensive things. Same as militarization, hiring military contractors, especially if you want to then defend all of those like supply chains. So maybe in some cases, this is not a full-on trade-off, but it definitely does trade off to a large extent. Therefore, Baji explains it causes economic harms in terms of the resilience that you then have in supply chains. If opening government cares about people getting trade, this makes it worse, because it makes you less resilient, not only to the potential military threats, but also to other issues that are like climate change and all the other things that are affecting resilience. That is worse, that makes the comparative, that explains the comparative will be actively better. The second thing we point out is the state assistance, which is that it actually increases the leverage that MNCs often have over these countries. But she explains that there is an incentive to provide assistance from the countries that is sufficient already. But we also point that where governments are at odds with MNCs, now they can't challenge them sufficiently because the MNC is allowed to have a military force. So it's much more difficult for countries to be able to actually leverage against them when they are doing bad things. All of that means that the comparative is both sufficient, but it's also actively better, and they are causing harms to things that they are trying to achieve, such as facilitating global trade. What are then PMCs? Opening opposition starts well, right? Then they, wait, this is the, no, actually, I want to do this one first. Why is the militarization done badly? Opening government identifies that it's probably hiring private military contractors. They are stationed to protect supply chains. Where opening government is incredibly assertive is how these PMCs act. They have a simplistic claim about companies. They say companies will be stupid. No one is claiming the companies will be stupid. They will be trying to secure profit. And I want to point to a hole in opening government because they have no analysis about the focus and the incentive will be to protect the vulnerable workers that they want to protect. I'm not sure how much Amazon or other MNC protects the well-being of their vulnerable workers in Bangladesh in any other way but military. So I'm not sure why that's the target of the protection, as opposed to just protecting the supply chain militarily when in convoys, shipping, etc. So the workers' claim also doesn't work. Second, this assumes that the companies, even if they have good incentives, have the oversight over how exactly the PMCs behave. We would posit that you don't have that, just as you don't have direct oversight over anything else in your supply chains deep down the line, right? You are relying on reports, you are relying on results. Opening opposition misses it, they assume that you find out, and then it's hard to hold it accountable. The issues you often do not find out at all. Obviously, the PMCs don't report on the treatment of civilians and use of force, etc. They report on whether the shipments were securely delivered, whether mines were safe. Those are things that can be reported and can be taken in without knowing that there are anything bad happening. What is the characterization of PMCs then? Opening opposition starts well, but their mechanisms are very, very weird. Before I talk about them, does opening government have anything?
So this motion doesn't force all MNCs to militarize. At the point at which you're okay to pay for militarization, you're probably so vulnerable that you don't have anything else to do. Let's talk about those cases.
No. Like, so first of all, I really don't think that, right? Like, I think in many cases there is an incentive from companies to have militarization of the supply chains to protect themselves from like reasonably not completely vulnerable trades. If they are so incredibly vulnerable, we already noted that there are alternatives. You can diversify. You are able to use the state assistance. I don't think this works. Opening opposition says that that the people are fired from the army, they are bad and incompetent, and you have to hire cheap. Might be true in some cases. In many cases, there are reasons why people join military companies because they have benefits in terms of pay, etc. Our claim is they would not be acting badly because they are rogue, but because they are functioning just as intended. Because the company incentive is to secure profit, and the PMC incentive is also to profit and to deliver the results that the companies are requiring. Vaji explains that the companies have the tendency of being over-aggressive. We point to things like Blackwater in Iraq when they're protecting convoys from massacres of civilians and really robotic behavior. You might be asking, isn't this a war example? But the logic is similar. You are protecting a delivery of something in a really bad way. We also point to have pre-existing harmful ties with PMCs in the same group, which means that you get those impacts of bad treatment of civilians and stoking conflicts all once. CGS Expense does nothing. They say competition with other PMCs. This is not what they're competing on, but I'm very proud of those.
Great. I think that speaker very much for a very fine speech and everyone for a very wonderful debate. Please virtually close the floor, shake hands, go to the main call, then you'll return. This is an open round, so you're getting the call and the feedback. Thank you very much for this wonderful debate. We'll give you the call and justification for the call. Just one note, it was a bit messy here and there. Some analysis wasn't necessarily connected to its flip side, which was the #1 problem. You can talk about it with me and Anna more in personal feedback. So the call is first to closing opposition, very narrowly to opening government, third to closing government, and fourth to opening opposition. So CO, OG, CG, OO. Why did we come to this decision? So from opening government, we generally get the following case. There are all types of entities that are currently trying to disrupt supply chains, particularly in the context of marine supply chains and things like that. These are pirates, terrorists, non-state actors that have violent incentives. And the way they characterize them is these actors aren't necessarily like the biggest threat in the world, but because they are a threat, they have some kind of weaponry, they can still create some kind of damage towards the workers, the supply chain, things like that. They, after that, list a bunch of harms that are associated with this, both in terms of the worker safety, both in terms of how this impacts the economy, and all of these type of things. The solution then provided to the PMC with incorporating presumably PMCs, but maybe something else, goes along the lines of either A, they are deterrents, and B, they can fight off these types of threats. The incentive as to why they provide, as to why the companies will most likely do this in a good way, goes along the lines of they have profit incentives, they care about their infrastructure, and they at least have some kind of incentives to mitigate this in terms of like them caring about PR and things like that. Opening opposition's case, in comparison to this, opening opposition's case goes along the lines of some mitigation as to why this is currently not that big of a problem, that currently there are some kind of states that intervene into, they protect these type of things like China, Russia, the United States, etc. And that once you give these types of weaponry or this type of ability towards companies, they can, they will either A, escalate these conflicts more, or B, could possibly create other harms in association with harming workers and things like that, crackdowning on mimes, stuff like that. Why does this lose to OG? The first and the first reason is I am unsure what is the extent of escalation that you're talking about. You point to a possible harm that could happen in this moment when you say, okay, for example, this could lead to further engagement and things like that, but also similarly likely, it seems from opening government that this could also lead to deterrence and fighting off in these particular moments. So I don't necessarily understand from you why the link between the now militarizing leads to more of such harms happening and things like that. I just don't think the analysis is well proven to justify this type of thing. Meaning that the material that is remaining is that these companies will now be able to crack down more on their like workers and things like that. But if we have to weigh the consequences of the two, and I think this is how Deputy Prime Minister specifically does it, where they explain, look, this obviously is bad, but the context that we are talking about is worse. Because what opening government brings as harms is this potentially leads to people dying, this potentially leads to disruption of the economy and things like that. Whereas I am uncertain, you make it sound is important, but you don't necessarily explain why it is important. or comparatively more important than this, why cracking down on like factories, workers, and things like that is. I understand that they have greater capacity to do it now. I understand that this may happen. I just don't think on the basis of weighing the problem that you're pointing out to is greater than the problem that opening government is pointing out to. So that's the top half generally. Obviously, I don't talk about everything that you said, but just like what is the broad chunks of things that you talk about. Bringing closing government. And this is a theme that's very, very hard to position in the debate because closing government does many things and it's hard to like wrap it up in a single thing, but trying to summarize it. The case that closing government proposes goes along the following lines. One, states could be potentially either engaging in dealing with these type of issues, or worse in terms of engaging in these type of issues, where they explain they have incentives to care about basically people in the cities and not people in rural areas. And what we're talking about is in rural areas, mines and stuff like that. And secondly, because they have broader political incentives, they may have incentives to, for example, destroy critical infrastructure just so that you kill off the what do you call it, the terrorists or pirates or whatever you are talking about. And on the flip side, companies have better incentives. There are two problems with this case, and this is why this loses to opening government. The first is, I don't understand why these two things are mutually exclusive, i.e. why the state, the company now having a military means that the state doesn't have a military or doesn't hire or doesn't engage within these type of things. And this is a burden that requires a lot more explanation or illustration as to how these two things will work together. Otherwise, what am I able to get from you is there is a problem because there is a military force or military way that states do it, and now there's another army that is there. The best version of understanding your case goes along the lines of, currently there isn't an incentive for the state to intervene in certain moments, but now the company has that incentive to do it. Then the way that we weigh you against opening government goes along the lines of, okay, are you able to better prove than opening government that the company is a better actor in the moments where there is a vacuum and the company can fill that in? The reasons that you point out to as to why the company is a better actor goes along the lines of, the company can now buy a drone, and let me just find out the second reason which you propose. And that they have a lot of people. They have a lot of size. They could potentially have big army and things like that. This is a capacity reason. It's not necessarily an incentive reason. It is valuable, but given that the core question that other teams are asking in this debate is whether or not the incentive of companies is adequate rather than the capacity of companies, I think most teams in this debate don't necessarily challenge this premise. Then this premise coming from opening government, it seems to be more important along the lines of, there are some things that you could alternatively run, which I can cover in personal feedback if you'd like to note. But this is generally how we weigh up these two things. This will be also explained more in relation to CO just in a second. So I'll come back to you when we're talking about rebuttal. But this is why closing government is not able to beat opening government. Why are you able to beat opening opposition? Firstly, mainly in terms of POIs that CG asks, in terms of asking, okay, but why? But if these companies are so rich and so powerful, can't they just bribe a cop and then the cop can intervene in the factory or mine or whatever, which generally proves that the OO case doesn't necessarily mechanize or isn't comparative as much. So like in terms of destructive rebuttal and direct POI's engagement, you are beating opening opposition. But secondly, there is some cases where closing government is able to point out to that there is a vacuum that the state doesn't intervene in. And in these cases where the company intervening in would be a good thing in relation to opening opposition. So because like you directly respond to your case and you prove this benefit, this is why CG is able to beat OO. Bringing closing opposition in the mix, another team that's a bit hard to position. So closing opposition does generally two things. One, some mitigation that goes along the lines of as to why when you are not doing this policy, you have an incentive to diversify your supply chain and things like that, which means that it's not so critical or so damaging if one ship is blown up or something like that in these types of moments, and that there is a monetary trade-off between these two particular things. And secondly, that there are just problematic incentives, even if military agents are operating within opening government's incentives, they'll most likely do things like scorched earth tactics, attack more civilians, or at least not care about this, create more damage on net, and stuff like that. Let's first compare this to opening government, because this is where the clash is closest, in my opinion, and very narrowly it goes to closing opposition. Firstly, I think the mitigation kind of stands. I don't really buy it that much, if I have to be completely honest, because this still doesn't completely deal with opening government's case, because the way that you explain it is there are some circumstances where like you will diversify your supply chain, but at least one supply chain will be attacked. So opening government's case will still operate within some of the scenarios, but it's still okay to mitigate them. Where the true crux of this debate operates in is whether or not when we're looking at the incentives and the outcomes. First, on incentives. If closing opposition is able to point out to that these people have problematic incentives in terms of the things that they're doing, and they could potentially do worse things, like, for example, like attacking civilians and things like that, and opening government, and these incentives are the same incentive reasons that opening government also bring up in terms of, you care about competition and you being efficient in these types of things, then that means that it is more likely that you're creating more damaging situations than non-damaging situations, i.e. more people end up being harmed by incorporating these types of what do you call them? These types of military agents and things like that. The positive version of viewing this from opening government's lens is, well, doesn't that mean that we still get our benefits in terms of deterrence and in terms of fighting people and things like that? You do get them. But here's the thing. Firstly, I don't think you explained deterrence well. The way you explain deterrence goes along the lines of, we're now adding an additional threat to against these types of groups, meaning that they're less likely to attack in these types of moments. I don't necessarily understand why this additional threat is that substantial in stopping them and things like that, which means that, given that's the case, and given I don't buy deterrence to that much of an extent, we have to evaluate this whether or not the argument coming from opening government in terms of we will attack and physically respond to people versus the argument, well, this will cause collateral damage and things like that. I think given that closing opposition is slightly able to win on the incentives battle and prove that this is a likely thing that they'll do, like likely attack other things, create fear into people in order to push them away, or this is the likely way that they think about this, the situations where these damages are caused seem to be more than the situations where you're just deflecting people and things like that. Again, this is super narrow. This is the longest comparison that we ended up discussing when we were deliberating, but very slightly we see this edging out to closing opposition as opposed to opening government. Maybe some other judges will have saw it in a different way, but this is in general the reasoning. So that's why closing opposition beats opening government. Let's look at the bottom half now, because to be completely frank to closing government, they have very good rebuttal against closing opposition. I think the rebuttal that closing a government brings goes along the lines of, on the alternatives point, for example, it won't be taken from different money pots and things like that, and these companies are very rich. The problem is that these things are kind of asserted, like not completely asserted, but they do demand a significant explanation in order for us to buy them, because the counter response that we get in Zero Whip goes along the lines of, they may be rich, but but military is also expensive, and we're kind of in this trap whether or not we buy one or the other. But the important thing is the mitigation isn't necessarily the substantial part of the CO case. The substantial part of the CO case goes along the lines of these companies will cause damage and cause problems and stuff like that. The response then that we hear from closing government goes along the lines of, okay, but governments have even a worse incentive and cause on net more damage and things like that. This is a fine response. However, this response is contingent on me buying your case. So far as I don't understand why necessarily state actors are mutually exclusive to private military, like companies hiring private military actors, like these two things not cooperating between each other, and closing opposition web is able to point this out as a problem and to explain that they won't necessarily like engage between each other, like the state actor will still be there. That's not necessarily a comparison that we can buy when we're addressing the two teams together. So because like CO is basically able to handle these responses back from closing government, CO is able to beat them within the debate. Finally, compared to opening opposition, I just think the analysis coming from closing opposition is much more better substantiated, even if it goes to the same outcome. I much more clearly see what the incentives are these people are and how they're likely to act, and the examples that they're given much better and much connected to this point than from opening opposition, which kind of seems assertive in this particular moment, which means that closing opposition is able to effectively extend on opening opposition. So this is why the call is first to CEO, second to OG, third to CG, and fourth to OO. This is the justification. Under 15 minutes. If you'd like personal feedback, please stay on. We can chat more.